Yarim-Agaev has many credentials. He is the president of Transcom International, distinguished visiting fellow at Hoover Institution. He has been a senior research fellow at Stanford, at MIT, visiting scientist in the Department of Chemistry and New York University. He is a scientist, he is an economist, and he is also a human rights activist who was a key member of the Moscow Helsinki group and the leader of the human rights movement in Russia, working with Andrei Sakharov, Vladimir Bukovsky, Parvir Khairikian, and many others in the late 1980s to promote the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union and new independent states. Dr. Yarim-Agaev, microphone is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Victor. I start with where I ended because that is my perpetual topic, and which is the general context of this war. And I reiterated a little bit in few words what I said last time, and then continue from that. So my major point is that the war in Ukraine is not a local war, but it's rather part of a global ideological war. And I speak on this subject all the time, and recently I wrote the article, which I hope Victor distributed among you. Maybe you had chance to see it. In any case, I can tell you that I'm writing a lot and speaking a lot on this subject, and I invite you to my YouTube channel, Yuri Yarim-Agaev, and to my Twitter channel, also Yuri Yarim-Agaev, where I post all my articles and video presentation and developed that subject in details. Anyway, what I said in that article, that there is ideological war between totalitarianism and democratic world, which actually lasts more than a century already, because it started with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. And since then, the totalitarian works expanded dramatically, and many countries joined it. And altogether, those countries launched and continue without any interruption the ideological war against a democratic world. The war which is dictated by their totalitarian ideology. They are expansionists, they are missionaries, they believe that only their system is good, and free democratic societies and capitalism are bad. And they feel and that ideology demands from their rulers that they carry out that ideological war. The war is not, we pay attention to it temporarily. Often we forget about that. We know well about the peace of this war, which was called the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was actually a fragment of more broad ideological war. And this war is not so cold, as we know, because it manifests itself in some major war, like it was in with the Second World War. And it also manifests with many hot proxy wars, as it was in Korea, Vietnam. And now we have such proxy war in Ukraine. Actually, since my presentation on December of 2022, we now have two proxy wars. The second one is between Israel and Iran, and I call it Iran not only because the most recent events, but starting with Hamas aggression. It was war with Iran. Hamas is only was a tool of Iran. So we have now two such proxy wars going on, and That's important to understand because the context of this war influences everything, including Ukrainian support by America and by other NATO countries, with which we have serious problems now, as you know. And it's very important for ensure this support and expand it to remind and explain to everybody that we are not talking about local war between Russians and Ukrainians. We are talking about global war. And the Russian war is directed first and foremost against America, which they say explicitly. I mean, they fight it on Ukrainian territory and against Ukraine because they see it as a weaker link of the Democratic Alliance. They don't dare to attack America directly, but the ultimate target of this war is the United States. And it's very important to understand it for everybody and for our politicians and those who resist any assistance to Ukraine, that they're not talking about defeat of Ukraine, but they're talking about defeat of the United States of America as well, unless they support Ukraine properly and let it win. Now, December of 2022 was a good time, and it was, I would say, high point for Ukraine in that war, because it was just soon after very successful Ukrainian counteroffensive of the fall of 2022, when Russian army was virtually running, and Ukraine succeeded to liberate many occupied territories. We also saw consolidation of Western support at that time by both America and European countries, which helped Ukraine with many new and very effective modern weapons. And we also witnessed at that time the weakening of the totalitarian alliance, which seemed very strong at the outset of the war, but which showed many signs of weakness when initial Russian aggression failed. And China removed itself, at least visibly, while still being on the Russian side in the background. Belarus is not willing to join Russia directly in the war. Kazakhstan, which also wasn't eager to take part in this war, and actually at some moments became critical of it. And Armenia more and more tries to move apart and show that sign still there. So at that moment, everything seemed to go well. Unfortunately, despite I say that there was significant support by the West, it was not sufficient, because had America and the European countries in the fall of 2022 provided much more weapons and modern weapons, which would include long-range artillery, airplanes, and other stuff, Ukraine had a real chance at that moment to defeat Russian army completely. But that didn't happen, and Russia was given a break. And since that time, the situation changed, and in many aspects, it changed for the worse. And I'll explain those changes on each aspect of this war. And first of all, the battlefield, the front lines of this war. Well, the main problem was the summer counteroffensive of summer 2023 by Ukraine actually failed. It was a lot of expectations that after a successful counteroffensive of the fall of 2022, then the summer counteroffensive would go even better, but it's really failed. And it's failed for several reasons. The main reason was that Russia was given time to enforce their defense, to mining all lines of defense, and more important, mobilizing much more troops. In that period between the fall of 2022 and the start of summer offensive, counteroffensive of Ukraine in 2023, Russia mobilized about 300,000 additional people. And there were other reasons, which I'll get back later, but the fact is that this long expected and counteroffensive didn't work. And Russia, after that, went for offensive. If it was in retreat before, and it regrouped and went for offensive and started to move and take over some Ukrainian territories, slowly, very slowly, with huge losses, but still moving ahead. It took Bakhmut, it took Marinka, it took Avdiivka, and it continues until now to move forward. So the main thing that it's regained initiative in that war. Well, Ukraine had many successes. Well, first of all, in elimination a great deal of Russian personnel and armament, tanks and other airplanes, etc. Also, Ukraine succeeded in moving into Russian territory and make some noticeable damage inside Russia, so that actually moving partially this war to Russian territory. But overall, if we consider what happened from the end of 2022 and until now on the battlefields, the situation changed to the worse. And when I say change for the worse, a change for the better, I definitely will talk always it from the Ukrainian perspective. So for Ukraine, a change for the worse. Now, in terms of personnel, I already mentioned that Russia lost a lot of people, but it mobilized a lot of people and continues its mobilization. It lost about 80% of its original army with which it started the war, but still it has much more people now than any other time. Well, Ukraine unfortunately also encountered heavy losses, and if we take it into smaller than Russian, but if we take it into proportion to Ukrainian army and Ukrainian population, I would say those losses are comparable, and the situation may be a greater burden now for Ukraine than for Russia. So in terms of armies and army personnel, I would say, and amount of fighting troops, I would say the situation for Ukraine has changed for the worse also. And the same thing, unfortunately, I can say about the armament. Well, the main thing which makes situation worse for America is huge delay with providing military assistance by both Europe and the United States. And we are still waiting and hoping that America eventually would give new portion allotment of arms to Ukraine. Europe did it after also long struggle with Hungary and some other opponents, but it's too little and too late, and Ukraine found themselves in huge disadvantage because although a lot of Russian armament was destroyed by Ukraine, Russia dramatically increases productions of its weaponry inside the country to replenish those losses. It wouldn't able to do that on maybe in most important armaments. For example, it fails to establish production of tanks in some significant number or airplanes, but in more simple weaponry such as artillery shells, it produces plenty of them. And Russia, in terms of artillery shells, now has a huge advantage over Ukraine in proportion, on average, say 5-1. So again, in terms of armaments, the situation changed for the worse. Army's morale, which is, I always stress how important is that factor. And I, from the very beginning, I said that Ukraine has advantage over Russia in this sense because Ukrainian army knows what is it fighting for, and the Russian army actually doesn't. And I would say the situation remained about the same. Ukrainian army still holds high morale level and high will. Russian army doesn't have high morale, but it didn't break down. It didn't collapse. And that's not such a good news because that was one of the hope. So it's about the same situation with army morale. Now, countries and governments, what is the morale and situation is again about the same as it was there. Ukrainians are still holding strong and ready to endure all difficulties of the war and stand for their countries. Majorities of Ukrainians doesn't want to surrender. They want to continue to fight. Unfortunately, many Russians still continue to support this war. Again, one of the problem and maybe one of disappointment that this support, if decreases, then at least not very noticeably and not on the surface. In terms of support of governments and strength of governments, they are strong in both countries. Zelensky still has strong support, but unfortunately, it seems that Putin's support is also strong enough, and it's based pretty much on the support of this war. Now, one important point is intelligence operation. That was a stronger point of Russia from the very beginning. And when I mean intelligence, I mean both military intelligence, but I also mean all Russian operation of disinformation using the agents of influence, etc. And in terms of military intelligence, I would say Ukraine may have maybe even better, but in terms of such things as informational war and agents and influence, and also Russian agents inside Ukraine, which try to split and undermine Ukrainian government, and we saw signs of that. And that remains about the same, which is a sign that Ukraine and the West hasn't done enough in that direction. Now, information war, I would say, changed to the worse. Again, for the worse for Ukraine. Again, in December of 2022, we had the situation when everybody believed and supported Zelensky. Nobody believed and supported Putin. And I mean not Russia and Ukraine, I mean America and the rest of Western world. Now, unfortunately, during this time, Putin managed to improve its propaganda and information war in the West and managed to get more supporters of this war, which directly influences the problem with military and economic support of Ukraine. So in that situation, it changed to the worse. Now, such very important factor as cohesiveness of democratic alliance and cohesiveness of totalitarian alliance. I would say that again, overall, it changed to the worse. I mentioned that totalitarian alliance is not so strong, but China behind the scene continues to support Russia. Kazakhstan and Armenia tries to move away, but the main problem is with the unity of the Western alliance. It seems that the Western alliance became much more shaky in its unity and support for Ukraine. I mean, in the United States, it shows first of all in the internal split between different political parties, and not only political parties, but actually many different political groups. So there is no internal unity in America in supporting Ukraine. In Europe, it shows in the lack of unity between members of European Union, and first of all with Hungary. Now, unfortunately, we get Slovakia, who elected the government, which is also against support of Ukraine. So the unity of democratic union is now in worse situations than it was before and at the end of 2022. And finally, as to economic situation in Ukraine and Russia, I would say it's about the same. Russia still managed to hold against sanctions and survive them, and even increase its military production. While Ukraine also manages to hold on despite the war, despite that significant part of it's occupied. That's all cities, and not only cities, are under constant bombardment and missile attacks. Ukraine miraculously manages to grow its grain and all other harvests, and actually not only feed itself, but export its food to other countries. And overall, definitely with significant part from the West, Ukraine economically holds on. It even started and expands the production of its own weaponry, and in some areas, such as drones, very successfully. So I would say economic situation is about the same. So if we take overall situation in many aspects, it's changed in this time for the worse for Ukraine. And it actually feeds the ground of many critics of Ukraine and its support, who say that Ukraine has already lost its war. The situation is hopeless. There is absolutely no sense to provide it any assistance. So that is the estimation of those changes and how crucial and important that are, is really very consequential for further political decision. Now, to that, I would say two following things, that those changes, also bad and quite significant, are reversible. And that's very important point. And I explain how they could be reversed, and the situation is not as hopeless as they see. And if we ourselves and America and Europe will not make it completely hopeless. And second thing which I need to mention, which is related to the reversibility and hopelessness of the situation, is that this is short-term picture which I drew. So those are changes about a year, a little bit more than a year long changes. Now, there is also long-term perspective, which actually I believe doesn't look so good for Russia at all. For example, the last thing which I mentioned, economic situation and how Russia manages to, with the sanctions against it. But I mean, it's a temporary success, if it can be called success. I mean, the Russian economy actually is deteriorating, and this process would accelerate. So we would see the worse and worse economic situation in Russia and its ability to support and sustain that war, and if time is given for that. And the same thing can be said about many other things, including Russian weaponry. As I say, the destruction of many most important types of weapons like tanks and airplanes could not be replenished by Russia. So this will be going down and down. Now, definitely the problem with long term is also with Ukraine, how much Ukraine can hold, because it's losing a lot of its people. It's sustaining ongoing destruction of its cities, death of the civilians, and how long can Ukraine hold economically, how long Ukraine can hold militarily, and how long can Ukraine hold morally. It's still open question. At the moment, it seems that they can, but it very much depends on our help. And I'm still very positive that if necessary assistance and help would be provided to Ukraine, that it still has an upper end and it still can win this war. And that's why I say that we can and we should win this war. And when I say we, I mean not only Ukraine, I mean America and NATO, because as I said many times, that defeat of Ukraine would mean also defeat of United States and defeat of all NATO alliance. And our victory would mean serious defeat not only of Putin, but also the whole totalitarian bloc, which is very important. Now, what should be done to reverse this process, to make sure and that we can win this war and to win it? Well, first of all, what can be done by America and Europe? The simple answer, the point number one, is provide all necessary weapons to give Ukraine advantage over Russia. Not only to put it at par, not only to level the situation, but I mean, it's shame to all of us that Ukraine, which has huge disadvantage in terms of number of people and personnel, which it cannot possibly increase in comparison with Russia, doesn't have more weapons and more modern weapons that Russia has, which can be done easily. I mean, it's the Russian might and the Russian technology is incomparable incomparably small with might, with the technology, with amount of weapons, with money, which Democratic Alliance has. And it's easily can give Ukraine absolute advantage in this sense. Definitely, all necessary economic assistance could and should be also provided to Ukraine. Now, we should stop trying to restrict Ukraine from attacking Russia on Russian territory. We're trying to do the same thing now with Israel. It's now typical approach by Biden administration, and not only by Biden, there are many supporters of this idea. It goes under very false premise of escalation, without even understanding how escalation works. And appeasement is the worst tool against escalation. Actually, the best way to avoid escalation is to overwhelm your enemy, to show how strong you are. And we know it from everyday experience. I remember when I was a boy in Donetsk at that time. I was at high school there. I mean, there were some gangs all around the city, and you would walk. If you walk in the evening, somebody would approach you and say, "Give 10 kopecks," which is 10 Russian cents, which is actually was only pretense to start to beat you. So if you try to avoid escalation in American sense and Biden sense, you would give that 10 kopecks, and that would assure that you will be beaten heavily, because that guy didn't need 10 kopecks. He needed to start to beat you. If instead you would hit them strong, most probably he would turn away and leave. And that's how it works. It works in everyday level. It works in relation between countries. It works in war. So we should stop this thing with both Israel and Ukraine, tighten their hands and not giving them long-term artillery, not putting conditions with giving them airplanes not to fly it over Russia, etc., etc. And that would be sufficient for Ukraine to succeed. Well, Ukraine also should make significant adjustments, which it can do, many of them even without our help. Well, the main thing which Ukraine should do is to modify and clarify its ideological and strategic position. Namely, Ukraine should make it very clear that this is not a war between Russians and Ukrainians, or even between Russia and Ukraine, but rather this is a war between democracy and totalitarianism, or freedom and tyranny. That's very important position on which Ukraine should stand. And that position itself would help to get more support from the West, because it's the same position which I explain all the time, that it's a general global war, that America is its participant, etc. If instead Ukraine sees that it's war on between only Russians and Ukrainians, to many Americans it becomes a local war which they don't want to be part of and don't care much about. And it would help very much Putin's propaganda and those who oppose any assistance to Ukraine. So that's one direct consequence of such a position. Now, that such position would also help to win information and psychological war against Russia, particularly inside the Russian army. Again, if you say the Russian soldiers, we Ukrainians fight against Russia, you all Russians are beasts, and we want to kill all of you. That's not very smart position in psychological war. However, if you say, look, guys, we are not fighting against Russia, we are fighting against tyranny, and this is tyranny both over you and over us. And you rather join us than fight against us. That's totally different position. Now, it's also important for the moral of society for propaganda inside Russia, for propaganda in Russian territories, and it's also important for post-war development of Ukraine, which I may be jumping ahead, but if I still believe in successful end of this war and victory of Ukraine, and when then there will be the issue how the new Ukrainian society will develop, on which pillars will it be built, on the pillars of political liberties and human rights, or on the pillars of fighting with Russian language and Russian monuments. Now, so that is the first point, which is, I believe, very critical to change and to clarify at least this whole context of this war. And that's what Ukraine can do instantly and without any help from other countries. Also, I write and speak all the time and spoke many times on Ukrainian TV. Ukraine should launch a psychological and information war, first of all, inside Russian army. Use weakness of its morale. That's very critical thing. And unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't do much in this area at all. And also extends this information war on the occupied territory and inside Russia. Again, Ukraine can do it pretty much by itself, maybe with some help from us, but I think America would be glad to provide such help to Ukraine. Now, one thing which I also strongly advise and advise it to Ukraine is to make, and the same to Israel, to make alliance between Ukraine and Israel. It could be political alliance, it could be even military alliance, but those two countries should show their solidarity with each other. They have common enemies, Russia and Iran. And those enemies are united and united against both countries. If Ukraine and Israel still don't understand it, that's very pity, but they should become close allies and help each other. And again, it would help to show the real context of both wars, that it was not wars of simply Russian against Ukraine or anti-Semites against Israel, and first those are proxy war of global ideological war, the main target of which for both Iran and Russia is America. Now, the Ukraine should do better trying to counter in Russian intelligence. Russian intelligence is very dangerous within Ukraine, and which is trying all the time to undermine Ukrainian government and introduce splits within that government, and they should do better trying to expose it and purge it. But also, with the help of CIA, FBI, and other Western intelligence, try to expose some agents of influence in the West. And that's very important because those agents of influence help to propagate Putin's propaganda and in many instances are quite successful turning many people and many politicians against Ukraine and assistance to it. Now, if there will be success in exposing at least several of such agents, some of them might be quite prominent, it would very much undermine the whole Putin's propaganda and his operation against help to Ukraine. So that should be done, and Ukraine should put effort to that and persuade its allies, its other Western intelligence to help it with that. And the last thing which Ukraine should continue to do and should expand it, it's military operations in terms of its originality and unexpectancy. I mean, the main successes of Ukraine were based on how smart, original, and unexpected their operation were. I mean, the main example is that fall counteroffensive in 2022, which was successful mainly because Russia was completely unprepared to it and didn't expect it. And that's why Russian army virtually ran at that time. But among many, we have many other successful examples. For example, Ukrainian operation against Russian Black Sea Fleet, when it managed to sink its major ships, and with this water drones, which again Russia was not prepared to that. The same thing happened with Crimea Bridge. Also, Ukrainian attacks inside Russia on Russian airfields in Crimea and Russia itself, on Russian plants, on Russian refineries were also successful because they were not expected. Each time it was something new, and that where is the Ukrainian force. If Ukraine abandons it and turns to very standard methods as Russia uses, which is Russia's weakness, it fails, as showed counteroffensive in summer of 2023, because it was predicted, it was expected, it was traditional, there was no originality in that, and Russia succeeded to stop it. So that's what Ukraine has, what Russia doesn't have. Originality, unexpected move, more initiative and more freedom to all levels of its army. That's what makes Ukrainian army strong in comparison to Russia, and it should build on that. While Russian army is too centralized, too stupid in many senses, and that's what makes it weak. So if all those adjustments are made, and there are no reason why not to make them, and first of all, if America and European countries finally realize that it is their war, that they should invest into them as much as they can, that they have a luxury of Ukrainian army taking the main burden of that war, and they should appreciate it fully. And their part is actually a smaller part and very achievable part to provide it with all necessary equipment and arms. If the West does that, if Ukrainians make some adjustments, which I mentioned, I believe this process can be reversed very soon, and that Ukraine can win this war, and we can win this war. Thank you.